Producing over 500 hours per week of talk radio, GCN Live is a world leader in talk radio. Archives for the following program can be found at gcnlive.com.
Welcome back to the Nutrimedical Report, and we have a dynamic report for you today with Harley Schlanger back, and we want to start out with the top reports that deal with what's going on inside the Democratic Party and the move that the party's finally getting the message that maybe things are so incompetent, so over the top, that's destroying not only the party, could destroy the nation of America, is morassing us into two potential major wars with two aircraft carriers heading toward the Persian Gulf and Iraq with special forces going in there. Despite the comments by Obama, he is now trying to unconstitutionally declare another war. And, of course, with the NATO forces, which are primarily American forces with a little smattering of Europeans, they're going to be deploying in the next few weeks forces in western Ukraine right after the blowing up of a Gazprom pipeline and the cutting out, which happened right after the Russians decided with the junta that they could not possibly get the deal with the Kiev maniacs, that they remain now basically at a point where they're going to draw us into a major war with 38,000 potential Russian troops on the border, and Putin is trying everything he can to not make this turn into a regional war, but yet they're being pulled into it. We don't know who did the pipeline explosion. Also, there's a major attack in Iraq on the largest refinery in Iraq. All these things converging on an incompetent president who couldn't operate an ice cream stand on a beach on a hot day. It's just mind-boggling. And again, the calls for the impeachment of Obama and his entire regime, by the way, it's not just Obama, it's his entire regime, are the epitome of corruptocracy and incompetence. So, Harley, what's the story? Tell us about the latest reports.
Well, let's start from something that seems removed a little bit from the war threat, but is not removed at all. There's a very prominent report now out on the wires in Europe. It'll probably never get out on the wires in the United States because we live under a media censorship that would make the East Germans and the Nazis proud. East Germans from the time of the Stasi and the Soviet dictatorship there. Right. There's a Swiss economist who put out a story on June 11th under the headline, "A new financial crisis is imminent." And then the subhead is, "Its course will be different. The financial system will be saved by looting citizens' savings."
Oh, boy.
Now, many of your listeners have heard me talking with you over the last months, going back actually over a year now, to the Cyprus bailout, when a new policy was introduced called bail-in. And people may have been frightened about that initially, but it hasn't happened yet, so people are saying, oh, maybe that was just a scare tactic or something. But the fact is that the European Union and the Swiss National Bank have both adopted a policy of bail-in as their approach to the next financial crisis. Now, as you and I have discussed, that's already law in the United States because of the Dodd-Frank Bill, Section 2, which says that in order to avoid bailouts, that is government, Federal Reserve and national government bailouts of the banks have recourse to take a portion of the deposits of their depositors, savings, checking, even those who are holding bonds or other kinds of financial instruments in the bank. That can be taken by the bank to protect them under conditions of crisis, and in return they can give stocks in the bank or some other form of IOU, which of course if the bank is collapsing is not worth very much. So people have thought this was not coming, but just this last week, it was introduced in Austria when a relatively small bank, the Ipo Alpa Bank, went into a collapse about a month ago. The government propped it up for a little while and then told them, go ahead, take your depositors' money. And immediately, Standard & Poor's reduced the rating of every single leading bank in Austria under the expectation that this would happen with the other banks. Now, what this Swiss economist points to is a couple of very important articles, one by a Union Bank of Switzerland economist, the other by Jacques Attali, who used to be Mitterrand's top economist, but who's now a leading commentator in France. What they both said within the last 30 days is that the current lull in financial markets, in other words, the fact that there hasn't been a banking crisis, a big banking crisis in the last months, should not be a ground for rejoicing, said Attali, but for worrying. And he said, and now we go back to the Swiss economist, this guy Alfonso Tour, who's someone who's a very well-known forecaster. What he said is that the financial system in Europe is in horrible shape. There will be bank failures. These will include the largest banks. And he said, as this happens, there will be a bail-in put into place. They will loot the savings and deposits in order to avoid bank failures. And at the same time, they will restructure government debts with a haircut on government spending. Now, what are they talking about? They're talking about cutting pensions and retirement and health care benefits. This is in Europe. This is not in the United States where these things, health care benefits don't really exist. They're saying that in order for the governments to survive, they're going to have to stop spending almost entirely.
Wow.
Now, think about what's happening in the United States. And I'll use the example of the Detroit crisis, where people may have forgotten this. But pensions in Detroit are going to be looted. The only question is, will it be 20 cents on the dollar stolen or 80 cents on the dollar? That's still before a court. That's what we mean by bail-in. Not just that the banks will steal, but the government can cut its debt. And most of that debt is owed to the American people. And so in the form of Social Security, in the form of Medicare and Medicaid, as well as in the form of pensions for government workers and so on. All of that is on the chopping block.
Wow.
Why? Because we're in a financial crisis that is worse today, as this consensus among European economists shows, worse today than in the summer of 2008 as we were spinning headlong into the September 2008 collapse of Lehman Brothers.
Yeah.
So that's why these idiots are trying to jack up a whole series of wars. Not just to make money on them, but to distract people and, if possible, to kill them before they can rebel against these incompetent governments controlled by the bankers.
Right. Well, I think that the crisis is at the point where, and again, this report that you have here by Deborah Hananiah Freeman shows that even the Black Caucus is split with Maxine Waters, and it shows that there are black Democrats that are basically taking money, a small number are taking money from Wall Street, and the other ones are basically saying, no, we gotta get rid of Obama. He's going to destroy not only the party, but he's going to destroy America. And, of course, his war policies are bringing us into major wars that are bankrupting the nation. These latest conflicts are unconstitutional. It's not a full congressional committee. He's literally proceeding by talking to a few heads that he thinks he can get on his side there. We call the maniacs or the war hawks within the Democratic Party that will be willing to do this, start these wars. And, again, putting troops in and bringing the 2 aircraft carriers to the Persian Gulf and putting NATO troops in western Ukraine is a direct provocation of World War III. This is the trigger that can start off a final conflict. It's an echo of 1914, isn't it?
Well, it's the whole world is in this crisis, but the solution rests with the American people, because there's a change underway in Europe that's reflected in opposition to the EU. But the Europeans can't do it themselves.
No, they can't. Amazing. Well, I guess the Democrats are not going to survive the Obama administration. He's so narcissistic, he could care less if he destroys the party.
If you're going to take just one natural supplement...
Charlie, I'm going to attach this article by Deborah Hananiah Freeman to the reports today, so people can actually read this. It's from EIR National, Executive Intelligence Review National. It's so shocking, and of course, whenever you think you can't be shocked by the next crazy thing that's going on, we have the next crazy thing that goes on, which it's hard to believe. And then, of course, let's continue this discussion. What do you think?
Well, let me summarize what Deborah wrote, because I think that would be helpful for your listeners. Deborah's the national spokesman for Mr. LaRouche, so she's my counterpart. I'm the Western State spokesman. She's based in Washington, and she's the national spokesman. And she actually has a lot of contacts, not so much in the White House, because the White House at this point is the enemy camp, but people who are in various institutions of government. For example, even though the State Department is part of the executive branch, there are many people in the diplomatic corps who are at odds with Obama. There are people in the Labor Department who have been trying to get the true story of the collapse of employment out. You have people in the judiciary who disagree with what the Supreme Court is doing. So you have a lot of people, and then especially military and intelligence types, who have become somewhat wary of talking to reporters, largely because of the anti-whistleblower policies of the Bush and Obama administrations. But they are willing to talk to political operatives in the hopes that their story will get out. They know the New York Times and others probably will suppress the story, but they are looking for a way of getting these stories out. So Deborah wrote an article about the shift going on inside the Democratic Party. Now, I've been reporting on this for weeks in terms of what's happening in Texas around Keisha's campaign, right, and what's happening in California around the opposition to Obama. So I had a particularly unique perspective on this. So I was looking at the most conservative Republican state in the Union, Texas, and the most left-wing liberal state in the Union, California, the two largest population states in the country, and finding a rebellion in both of those states. Now then, last week we saw what happened in Virginia with the stunning defeat of Eric Cantor. And right, I think this is important to put in here, because it's not just Democrats starting to move against Obama, but Republicans moving against the Republican leadership.
Exactly.
And this was really not something that you could easily classify as a Tea Party versus the establishment.
No.
Cantor had a lot of sympathy with some of the Tea Party groups because of his consistent statements that he's for fascist austerity. But what he ran afoul of was through his support of Wall Street. There are two things about Eric Cantor, and for people who don't know who he is, he was the Republican number 2 person in the House of Representatives. He was a right-wing Zionist congressman, but he was right behind John Boehner. And he's a very close collaborator with Paul Ryan, who you've pointed out is one of the leading proponents of fascist austerity in the Congress. Now, two things that characterize Cantor. One, total opposition to Republicans joining the fight for Glass-Steagall. Why? You know who the 3 largest contributors to Cantor were? Goldman Sachs, Blackstone Group, and Citicorp.
And Blackstone,
he's Wall Street to the core.
Blackstone was involved with the funding of the insurance for the World Trade Center that built the Aria complex on the insurance money for when the World Trade Center was destroyed.
Well, Blackstone is one of the largest hedge funds, and it's very well connected. But you can see Cantor is a Wall Street guy. So he was telling Republicans who were saying, look, why don't we join on this Glass-Steagall bill to take the power away from the too big to fail banks? And Cantor kept telling Republicans they would lose their positions if they supported it. And one of the Republicans who's a co-sponsor of that bill, Walter Jones, was removed by Cantor from his chairmanship of the Military Affairs Committee.
Wow.
So this is the kind of sleazebag Cantor is. But here's the other one. When Republicans went to Cantor to say, we want a bill of impeachment against Obama, Cantor said, forget it, we're not going to do it.
Wow.
And so his defeat to a largely unknown guy who didn't really have a lot of money was largely due, according to the exit polls, to his opponent identifying him as a Wall Street Republican. And so what we're seeing is a rebellion against these Wall Street guys in both parties.
Yeah, exactly.
Who refuse to move against Obama, who refused to move against the too big to fail banks after the collapse in 2008, who refused to move effectively to stop Obamacare, which is a bailout of the insurance industry, among other atrocities involved in it. And so you have people in both of the two parties who are corrupt, immoral, and have to go.
Yeah.
And so what Debbie wrote about is inside the Democratic Party, where people are afraid to openly oppose Obama. You can see the fault lines occurring, and she used the very interesting case of the Black Caucus, where the people who used to be talking with us and used to be very much worried and angered about Obama are now supporting him strongly. Why? In every single case, it's because they're now with Wall Street, like the case of Lacey Clay from Missouri, the case of Elijah Cummings from Maryland. To the extent they're getting large amounts of money from Wall Street, they are in Obama's hip pocket.
Wow.
And that's true in both parties. So what we're seeing is a potential rebellion exploding in both parties, where you can see little bits of it. The 28% vote among Democrats for Keisha Rogers, who called for Obama's impeachment in Texas. The defeat of all the major political parties in Europe who supported the European Union in the parliamentary elections last month. And now the throwing out of Eric Cantor.
Right.
And so in the midst of this, what happens? You have an escalation of terrorism against Russia in Ukraine and against a weak but sovereign nation in Iraq by the same group of people, the British, Saudi, Obama-funded terrorist operations.
Right. In fact, that's one of the articles they have posted here, is that Saudi Arabia and Qatar, which have got a lot to gain by the price of oil, because honestly, these nations, believe it or not, although they have a lot of oil, they're hanging financially by their fingernails. They always spend more money than they even take in. And they know that without America constantly being the golem to continue to support them and their regimes, they're going to have regime change. Even among themselves, there's 17 different royal families in Saudi Arabia, all at each other's throats, ready to take down the so-called Saud regime. And the same with Qatar. I mean, without
well, here's something interesting, Dr. Bill. I don't know if we sent a link on this, because I don't know if we had it up yet. But this morning, Maliki said Saudi Arabia is behind the terrorists threatening Iraq.
Oh, we know that. We know that Saudi's behind the terrorism affecting Syria, too. Saudi Arabia is behind trying to attack Iran, which is going to guarantee World War III, these maniacs.
A sudden change in the wind. The day grows dark. Alternative to the mainstream media. We're the premier independent talk radio network. We are GCN.
I remember when I lost my mind.
There
was something so pleasant about that day.
This is foolishness. This is ridiculous.
Even your emotions have an echo in so much space. And when you're out there without care, yeah, I was out of touch. But it wasn't because I didn't know.
Welcome back, and Harley, let's continue on these articles. Saudi Arabia we need to cut them loose. This idea that we signed this OPEC agreement that we have to protect these empires no matter what the hell they do. The same with the state of Israel. We supply these idiots and these maniacs, these trigger-happy wackos, and they do things like blowing up the largest refinery complex in Iraq, which is driving up the price of oil, which, of course, these banksters think they can profit on both sides, wring the profit out of the people when they set up Obamacare, which is the Unaffordable Health Care Act, which is basically taking away a lot of health care from a lot of people. It's not fixing the problem at all. It's going to bankrupt a lot of doctors and hospital clinics, etc. And on the other hand, eventually the insurance carriers, they'll all die too, because the prices will get so high that the marketplace won't be able to support people buying private insurance. So in a few years from now, we'll be stuck with something like the U.S. Postal Service for health care. It'll be insane. It'll be worse than the VA. And the same thing with our policy of our military. We pour millions of dollars and billions of dollars into useless equipment like the Joint Strike Fighter. We put our carrier groups in danger like we did to the Ronald Reagan. It's now a radioactive trash heap ready to, they're talking about sinking it in the deepest part of the ocean. We have 2 aircraft carriers and equipment as forces were moving into Iraq in a war we can't possibly win when it's a civil insurgency. And our ally, believe it or not, is Iran, who wants to protect the holy sites that the Sunni ISIS maniacs want to blow up. These holy sites go back 14 centuries. I just think that we just don't get, or 8 centuries, I mean. I just don't think that we get it, that Obama and the bankers are lockstep on doing things. They don't care how many people they kill, how many economies they destroy. They don't care about anything.
Well, let me tell you one of the ways we can fight back. One of the links I sent to you is a statement titled Saudi Arabia, Qatar are the funders of ISIS. And the subhead is Impeach Obama immediately. But here's a statement from LaRouche in this second paragraph where he says, Obama has gone beyond all limits and must be impeached immediately because he is becoming an international bandit. And then he goes on to say, the question that must be answered is, wouldn't it be a much more effective response to the situation in Iraq to take action against Saudi Arabia and Qatar? Because if you look across the whole area of the world from North Africa through the so-called Middle East, up into the underbelly of the former Soviet Union, all the way over to China, everywhere you have is so-called Islamic terrorism as an issue. It's funded by the Saudis.
Right.
And this funding from the Saudis was not a Saudi decision. It came from a British-Saudi discussion back in the period of the original invasion of Afghanistan by the Soviets. And this is, again, where Americans forget their history, if they ever knew it. But in the early 1980s, the decision actually was in the Carter administration that something called the Arc of Crisis was developed, and this was attributed to Brzezinski, but it actually goes back before him to an academic named Bernard Lewis, or Sir Bernard Lewis, and it was originally called the Bernard Lewis Plan. And what Lewis said is that the problem we face in all these countries is their belief that they should be sovereign nation states. And he said, instead, these are just collections of tribes and ethnic groups and religions and so on, and really should be broken down into their smallest components. Now, why would the British Empire want that? It's obvious that they're more fearful that sovereign nation states will ally against them than they are the tribes that have their whole power based on local issues will ever pose a threat. Right. So the British policy was never for nation states, except briefly at the end of World War I, when they supported the idea of nations to overthrow the Ottoman Empire. And then they quickly moved back from these nation states into using them as cauldrons of battlefields around religion. And the British directed the whole thing. And so the modern fight comes from the British orders to the Saudis through people like Prince Bandar, who until recently was the most important figure in Saudi Arabia as the ambassador to the United States and then intelligence director. They've really pretty much put him under wraps because we exposed him so much that he became useless. But what was the policy? It was to create terrorist networks that are Shia, that are Sunni, that are Alawite, that are smaller and smaller groupings that will do what? Destroy any potential of nations to progress.
Right.
And the most unprogressive of these nations is Saudi Arabia, where women are treated like sex slaves.
Yeah.
The most of the population, women and men, are treated like servants or as though they live on a plantation. And it's ruled by tribal leaders who themselves purport to be highly religious, but are the biggest gamblers and drinkers and pornographers and womenizers on the planet.
Yeah, exactly. In fact, they have the number one nation on earth for sex slavery is Saudi Arabia, and the next, believe it or not, is Israel. And Israel, by the way, is lockstep in many of the collaborations with these horrifying actions around the world, including the use of micronukes at the World Trade Center. And people need to understand that there is collaboration with Israel, our two rogue nation allies in the area that are causing havoc and balkanization of all these groups into smaller tribal areas.
And look at who those two countries oppose the most. Now they're talking about Iran, but they were hostile to Saddam Hussein because Saddam had a very strong nation. I mean, he used the oil in Iraq to develop the country. Now, he was a dictator because he was dealing with a group potentially warring tribes, but he tried to give them a national identity, and that national identity was reinforced through the military. So what was it that when Bush and Cheney took over Iraq, what was the first act they did after they captured Baghdad? They sent in Paul Bremer to break up the Iraqi military and to create a situation where today the Iraqi military is having trouble fighting against 1,500 to 2,000 jihadists.
Right.
Now, the whole point here, without going into all the details on this, which you can find most of these on our website, LaRouchePack.com, but the most important point here is that this is not a failure of policy, what's happening in Iraq today. It's the intent of policy to break up these nations. The target of Saudi Arabia and Israel was Assad in Syria. It was Saddam in Iraq. Saddam basically was a Sunni, and the Shia regime in Iran. It's also Egypt, because they don't want Egypt functioning as a nation. And with all its problems, Egypt has a national culture that goes back thousands of years. So does Iran, as the Persian culture. As you pointed out, so do Syria and Iraq have a kind of tradition which is included in the Christianity in the region as well as Islam.
But they also have a culture that tolerates Islam and Christianity and other religious groups because they believe in overculture that is, quote, Egyptian or Syrian, which is why you can have Bashar al-Assad with, at the table, Christian Maronites, Sunni, Shia Alawites, etc., and
that's what the British Empire wants to crush, because they don't want nations that are based on higher common interests. They want people to be back in their tribal enclaves so they can easily be controlled. And the tragedy here is the United States, which was created as a nation to oppose that kind of imperial policy. The United States under Bush and Obama has become the enforcer of that British policy.
Yeah, exactly. The golem of the monstrous British regime. Welcome back, and Harley, let's wrap it up. In this week, what are the primary things that need to be done? We need to start moving toward things that deal with the drought in the West, which is NWAPA, which LaRouche has been touting for years. We need to impeach Obama. We need Glass-Steagall. There's a number of points that are in here, actually. I think there's a 4 different laws that I think that were referred to by Linda LaRouche. And
well, let me go through those quickly and then get to something that gets right at this impeachment question. We need Glass-Steagall because that breaks the power of the Wall Street banks. We need a national bank because we need a credit system. We need the credit, point 3, the credit should go into high technology, especially high energy flux density productive processes, including machine tool production and so on. And point 4 is the development of bringing fusion power online, so that we have an inexhaustible power source.
And by the way, those 4 steps. I mentioned before that because of my classified exposure to these things, that we already have nuclear fusion technology and have had it for more than 40 years. The problem is that they've sequestered these in specific corporations that have sequestered it away. So we really have, I call these stretched skins of nations over the superstructure of Earth Inc. run by transnational corporations. And that's what the real problem is. The problem is the transnational corporations have now taken over the nation state and made them. And
you have to break their power. And Glass-Steagall is a good way to start because they're all interrelated, whether it's energy, raw materials, insurance, or banking. They're all interconnected. And by breaking the power of the too big to fail banks, you won't have to deal with bailout or bail-in. And as I always say, there'll be no bail for the bankers. But let me get to this impeachment question because, look, what's happening now around Iraq and what's happening in Ukraine also, which is a total atrocity being conducted by a coup regime run by Nazis. For example, this pipeline that was just blown up, LaRouche, who's the head of the right sector, the hardcore Nazis in the Kiev government, LaRouche is in the cabinet. He said 3 months ago that they're going to blow up the Russian pipeline, and now they've done it. The situation in Iraq, where it's clear that Bush and Cheney's war and Obama's continuation of it never intended to bring democracy to that country, but to destroy it. Now, in the midst of this, who should surface but that arch criminal Tony Blair, who was right at Bush's side. He's the one who provided the so-called slam dunk intelligence on weapons of mass destruction in the hands of Saddam. He's been there to guide Obama. Blair is a mass murderer of the highest order. And what's interesting is there's a law in the British system which says that someone who's out of office can still be impeached, brought to trial, and sent to prison for illegal actions they committed while they were in office. And a bill of impeachment was just introduced in the British Parliament by a man named Sir Peter Tapsell, who's an 84-year-old Tory member of Parliament known as the Father of the House. And today, he opened the Prime Minister's questions, which is the key parliamentary, every week, twice a week, they have questions to the Prime Minister. And he said today that the House of Commons should commence procedures of impeachment against Blair for misleading the House over the Iraq War. Tapsell said, and I'm reading this from our news site, Tapsell said there was a growing sentiment to impeach Blair for misleading MPs, members of Parliament, over the 2003 invasion of Iraq. He told the Independent newspaper that the impeachment procedure has not been used since 1806, but it still applies, and it should be brought in this case. Now, Blair, 3 days ago, wrote a major op-ed saying, I'm not responsible for what's happening in Iraq. It would have happened even if Saddam had stayed in power. Now, this guy is a liar on top of everything else. But what's interesting is that the process in England is now opening up to make him pay for this. He could go to jail. And they could also recommend that he be put on trial in an international tribunal for war crimes. Now, who else has committed war crimes? Bush, Cheney, and Obama. This is not a partisan issue.
We can even go back
question of truth.
We can even go back to Bill Clinton with Kosovo and Yugoslavia. I mean, this is multiple administrations crossing both parties that have done horrendous things.
And then Bush Sr. for the original Iraq War.
Exactly. Yeah, Bush Sr., who prosecuted the Iraq War and just trashed the nation. And we have the depleted uranium disaster there that's destroyed the biology of the people there, too.
So what's interesting is that after all this fight that we've waged for years, going back to April 2009 when LaRouche first said, look, Obama's a psychopathological narcissist who must be removed, we're finally reaching a point where there's a consensus emerging that minimally recognizes the danger of continuing with Obama, but also recognizes the danger of not dealing with it. That as long as he's in there, he can continue to do things. For example, sending in 275 troops supposedly to guard our embassy. That's the first step toward a U.S. involvement in a new Iraq war.
Right.
I mean, can't people see that? People are going to trust Obama, who's lied to us repeatedly when he says, oh, we're just there to protect Americans. If you really want to protect the Americans in Iraq, and there are 25,000, including a couple thousand associated with the Baghdad embassy, you need more than 275 troops. And so the question is, are they planning airstrikes? Are they planning something else? And here's the irony, Dr. Bill. I know you like ironies because they're the highest form of truth. Who is it we're talking to now about allying with against the terrorists? The Iranians.
Yeah.
Now,
in fact,
let's go one step further.
Yeah.
Why don't we admit that we should never have tried to overthrow Assad and join with Assad in helping him to put down the terrorist revolt in his country?
Well, this thing with ISIS is very likely to try to spread across to Syria, and Assad's going to have to deal with it. And in fact, in a sense...
Well, he already is dealing with it. It's actually going into Jordan and Lebanon next.
Right. Well, see, Jordan's not going to be unscathed with this. And the problem is the Israelis think that they're going to be unscathed. No. This is going to get way out of control. And the problem is that Israel thinks, well, we've got all these nuclear weapons, we've got biological weapons, we've got an air force. They can't withstand a full onslaught of biological, chemical, and all the other weapons of all these countries. And there's like the old story, it says there's a saying going back 5,000 years in the Middle East, me and my brother against my cousin, me and my cousin against my enemy. That saying goes back long before Islam. And this kind of warfare is what happens there. And we were promoting it with the British model rather than trying to promote moderation with Islam, moderation with these countries. Better, like Mossadegh back in Iran, all he wanted was the plastics and the petrochemical industry and a better percentage of the deal with the British petroleum companies. He didn't want to take all the money. But the British said, no, we're greedy, we want it all. And so they got him in prison. Eventually he died. And then they put the Shah of Iran in there. This goes on, and we do these things over and over again. And it's going to come back and bite us, because now these countries have got very advanced weapons. They can come into our homeland. They probably have biological weapons sitting in the lyophilized refrigerators all across the nation in large cities. We're going to really take it. And Russia basically isn't just going to deploy nuclear missiles in Cuba. They're going to have it in Nicaragua, Central America, Venezuela. As we keep pushing this envelope, we're going to really, really face a massive thermonuclear, biological, and chemical attack on our nation if we keep pushing the Russians and the Chinese away rather than making a deal.
Well, I think the important thing for your listeners to go away with is that impeachment is much closer as an option than they would know. Keisha Rogers is in Washington now meeting with Democrats and Republicans who got interested in the fact that she ran such an effective campaign. And we need people to join us in moving the Congress. And if you need information on what to say or what to do, give my office a call, 800-922-2907. That's 800-922-2907. I call this Impeachment Central, 800-922-2907.
That's wonderful. It's amazing what your foundation has been doing, Harley. I'm so proud of your organization and what you've been doing, leading the way with intellectual honesty, trying to get things going. And again, that's the only way to actually move forward, is to actually be honest with yourself and your nation. We have a corrupt government that needs to be removed, but we've got both administrations, revolts in both parties, and it's due time for it to happen. We're going to have hour 3. We're going to discuss a lot of the similar things with U.S. Justice Foundation with Michael Connolly.
Henry Ford once said, a man who stops advertising to save money is like a man who stops a clock to save time. Alex Castle here, the National Account Executive at GCN. I have the ability to